The river roared with a furious rage, its muddy waters churning over jagged rocks and uprooted trees. Beneath storm-black skies, two figures clung desperately to an overturned wagon, the icy current threatening to sweep them into the darkness. In that brief blink of moonlight, one promise sparked in a single moment of mutual salvation, foretelling a fate neither could foresee. But both would meet with all their hearts. The wind whispered through a grove of cottonwood trees, their leaves turning silver in the late afternoon sun. Grains of golden dust danced across the rutted trail that wove through rolling hills dotted with sagebrush. It was early autumn, the sky a brilliant stretch of pale turquoise, and the nights were already turning cold. Bison herds had thinned, replaced by hungry wolves and cunning outlaws roving the edges of civilization. No one on this frontier was entirely safe, for man and nature alike tested the mettle of every traveler. On a small knoll overlooking a shallow valley, a Navajo warrior named Tifavan paused. He was a lean man, uncommonly tall for his people, with a proud bearing that had not diminished despite his long journey far from his ancestral lands. His face bore the harsh lines of desert sun and wind-scarred nights. Dark hair framed his weather-worn features, and a single eagle feather, tattered from countless storms, hung from a small leather cord around his neck. It was a keepsake, one of the very last he owned from home. Tifavan had traveled hundreds of miles, on foot when his horse died, by borrowed mounts when he could barter, always pushing onward without precisely knowing why. In truth, he was a man in exile by choice if not strictly by law. Years before, he had left his homeland to protect his younger sister and mother from conflicts with new settlers. But heartbreak found him. His family was scattered, his sister taken by illness, his mother gone soon after. Grief gave way to a yearning for solitude, and the open plains of the northern territories offered that in abundance. For the past year, he had drifted from dusty settlement to lonely canyon, guided by an ache he could neither name nor shake. He gazed out at the low valley. Autumn's glow fell gently on a patch of farmland near a small, slow-moving river. A single wooden cabin stood in isolation, its plank walls patched against the elements. A scrawny horse grazed out back, tethered to a rickety rail. There was a certain quiet to the place, a hush that drew Tifavan closer, though he could not say why. Clara Finch was inside that cabin, standing on a stool to fix a broken window latch. She had been a widow for 3 months. Her husband, Henry, had been thrown from a spooked horse on the outskirts of a mining camp. A senseless accident in a land where violence and tragedy had been more expected. At 30, Clara's green eyes held a determination that kept her upright through fresh sorrow and a fresh start. Life had brought her here to Wyoming territory, pulled by Henry's dream of building a modest farm from the wild land. But now that dream fell solely on her shoulders, every splinter in the cabin's walls reminding her of how fragile her life had become. Her greatest goal was survival, keeping the farm afloat, planting a winter crop, and fending off the creeping loneliness that threatened to claim her. However, her fear loomed just as large that she would fail in the harsh frontier, that she would lose her last link to Henry, that she would eventually vanish into these wide plains without ever finding hope again. And above all, she was scared of being truly alone, with no one to trust. That afternoon, she was reminded of her isolation by the shape of a man approaching from a distance. Clara saw him first as a silhouette near the horizon, calm and unhurried. She kept a rifle by her side, a gift from her father, and though she loathed the idea of violence, she had learned caution in the lawless West. Only a fool wouldn't. Tifavan had no illusions about how strangers might greet him. Over the years he had met contempt more often than kindness, suspicion rather than welcome. Yet he approached anyway, because the day was winding on, and the promise of a small settlement was too tempting a comfort to ignore. He carried a single small saddlebag slung across his shoulder, empty of food for 2 days. As he drew nearer to the cabin, he raised his right hand in a gesture of peace. Clara observed him from behind a cracked window pane, heart pounding. A Navajo, that much was clear from his dress and manner, though far from his southwestern homelands. His face was guarded, his eyes watchful. She hesitated, uncertain whether she should step out or hide until he passed. But a sense of empathy, perhaps also tinged with curiosity, led her to open the door. Rifle in hand, but pointed at the ground, she waited on the porch, shoulders squared. "I've come to ask for water," Avon said quietly, his voice hoarse. Clara studied him for a moment. "There's a well in back." "Go ahead." Avon nodded in gratitude and moved cautiously toward the side of the cabin. Clara followed, not wanting to let him out of her sight. He worked the well pump, drinking deeply from his cupped hand and splashing water over his face. Dusk was rapidly claiming the sky, and Clara could see the hunger etched on him. Despite her caution, something in her heart spoke. The land was harsh enough. A bit of kindness cost her little. "Have you traveled far?" she asked. "A long ways," Avon replied, offering nothing more. Clara could see he was not a man of many words. "I can spare some beans and cornbread," she offered. "Not much, I'm afraid. But you look like you could use a meal." Avon lowered his gaze in a half-bow. "That's kind of you. I thank you." That night, he sat by the hearth in her modest cabin, careful not to track mud on the newly swept floor. She gave him a portion of her meager supper, and though it was simple fare, he savored every bite. Moments of silence lingered, but they were not entirely uncomfortable. In those shared minutes, an unspoken understanding passed between them, two wounded souls in an unforgiving land, each shouldering a heavy burden. Avon's goal was uncertain. He carried the memory of broken ties and the lingering call of home. Beneath his stoic exterior, he feared never finding peace. Clara's goal was survival, shadowed by the fear of absolute solitude. In that silent exchange, they recognized something familiar in each other's ice resilience. Eventually, Avon made to leave, gathering his few belongings. Night had fallen fully. The vast darkness outside offered no warmth, no guarantee of safety. Clara wrestled with her instincts, but compassion won out. "You can stay in the shed out back," she said, voice even. "If you need to." Avon's expression was difficult to read, but gratitude flickered in his eyes. He bowed his head. "I'm obliged." She merely nodded, still uneasy, yet moved by a shared sense of adversity. They parted without further words. She gave him a blanket. He stepped out into the cold. And so the night pressed on, the wind murmuring across the valley in a refrain of promises and unspoken hopes. The next 2 days passed in an uneasy routine. Clara tended her small patch of land, a meager orchard of young apple saplings that Henry had planted, hardly able to sink roots in the rocky soil. Avon repaired her broken fence posts and cleared brush near the river. He worked with quiet efficiency, never asking for anything beyond water and the occasional shared meal. At dawn, he would vanish to scout the surrounding terrain, perhaps searching for safe passage north. By twilight, he returned to her homestead, as if drawn by the single light flickering in an endless stretch of darkness. They spoke in short sentences, learning little of one another's stories. Clara did glean that Avon was heading farther up into the territory, near the booming gold towns, though for what purpose he would not say. She still felt twinges of fear, not entirely sure if she should trust him, but no sign of threat emerged. The man was as controlled as any she'd ever met, eyes reflecting some deep sadness she sensed matched her own. On the 3rd day, a rumor spread from a traveling peddler who stopped by. The rains up north had swelled the local rivers beyond their banks, making some crossings impossible. The small waterway near Clara's farm, ordinarily docile, was transforming into a wild torrent fed by weeks of distant storms. Avon listened, brow creased. If he was to continue his journey, he would need to cross that river soon or risk being stranded. The peddler mentioned a stable crossing about 10 miles west, but it was rumored that outlaws roamed those parts, picking off travelers or looting makeshift ferries. In the shed that night, Avon lay awake. He stared at the rough plank ceiling, the shadows shifting with every flicker of the moon. Memory tugged at him, a swirling desert wind in his homeland. The last sight of his mother's face before he set out. She had pressed a token into his hand, an eagle feather, symbol of protection. He did not know if it had protected him or merely reminded him of all he'd lost. He exhaled a slow breath. Tomorrow he would approach Clara, ask her if she wished to cross the river as well. He suspected she might need something from town, or perhaps a chance to gather supplies. Yet what truly weighed on him was something deeper, a sense that crossing alone was not the right path. At dawn, T. Avon emerged from the shed, prepared to speak with Clara. But trouble found them first. From the east came the clatter of hooves, 4 riders in dusty coats, guns strapped openly at their hips. Clara, alerted by the noise, stepped onto her porch, heart pounding. She recognized the lead rider as Ford Knowles, a local troublemaker who had once tried to cheat Henry out of a farmland claim. With him were 3 rough men, all with the look of bored desperados seeking easy prey. "Morning, Mrs. Finch," Knowles called out with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "We heard you might be needing some help around here." Clara's mouth went dry. "I'm fine," she said curtly. "Don't recall asking for assistance." The man chuckled. "Well, Henry's gone, rest his soul. You might find it hard to manage on your own. Me and my boys can keep an eye on this land. Make sure no harm comes your way for a fair price." His tone dripped with false benevolence. Clara knew better. This was extortion, pure and simple. She tightened her grip on her rifle. "I won't be needing your services," she said firmly. Knowles' eyes shifted to T. Avon, who stood behind Clara, silent yet poised. A slight sneer curled the corner of Knowles' mouth. "Got yourself a new hand." Clara said nothing. Tia Avon's posture spoke volumes. He was ready if things turned hostile. "Suit yourself?" Knowles continued, his tone turning colder. "Just remember, river's floodin' soon. Could be a lot of dangerous folks crossing. You never know who might come around." He touched the brim of his hat mockingly. "Be seen, you Mrs. Finch." The riders turned and galloped away, dust hanging in their wake. Clara released a shaky breath. She had faced them down before, always with Henry's steady presence backing her up. Now she was alone, or nearly so. She glanced over at T. Avon, who stared after the riders with an unreadable expression. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" "Standing there, not leaving." He nodded once, acknowledging her words but offering no grand statements. Yet Clara felt a subtle gratitude emanating from him, as if he, too, found some measure of reassurance in her presence. Midday arrived with a harsh glare and the sky turned the color of steel. The air was thick with moisture, and a distant rumble of thunder warned of coming storms. T. Avon spoke first as they stood by the orchard. "I need to cross the river tomorrow," he said. "Further north, I have business. Maybe trade for a horse to keep traveling." Clara wiped sweat from her brow. "I'd planned on heading to the next town soon," she admitted. "I need flour, salt, and some things. But that crossing, the peddler said it's nearly impassable." He nodded, gaze steady. "We have to try before the water rises more. Another storm, we lose our chance." She paused, eyes flicking to the patch of land behind the cabin. She thought of Henry, of how they'd poured their meager savings into the farm. Part of her dreaded leaving it unprotected, especially with men like Ford Knowles lurking around. But she needed supplies, and there might not be another opportunity before winter set in. "All right," she said finally, her voice wavering just a bit. "We'll go together tomorrow at first light. See if we can get across." T. Avon inclined his head. A brief hush passed between them. In that silence, Clara recalled the ring of Ford Knowles' mocking voice, the threat he posed. For a moment, she considered asking T. Avon if he would stay on after they returned, help guard the place. But fear of dependence on a stranger held her back, along with her own pride. That night, dark clouds gathered over the distant mountains, and the wind rattled the cabin's shutters. Each crack of thunder made Clara tense. At the table, she gently wrapped a few precious items in a cloth sack, her mother's necklace, a photograph of her father, and a folded letter from Henry. Things she could not bear to lose if the farm should ever be taken from her. In a land of shifting loyalties and unstoppable storms, possessions were fleeting. She resolved to protect what truly mattered, even if that meant trusting a man she barely knew. T. Savin prepared as well, though he had little to pack. He checked the edge of his hunting knife and rolled his bedroll tight. The memories of the desert pulled at him, reminding him of the first promise he had ever broken, a promise to keep his sister safe. Even though he knew there was nothing he could have done to stop her illness, guilt still gnawed at him. He wondered whether traveling on, forging new alliances, or saving strangers from danger might help him atone for a vow that life had not allowed him to keep. Morning brought no calm. The sky was bruised and swollen with impending rain. T. Avon and Clara rose with the first dim glow, loaded her mare with whatever supplies they had, and set off. The crossing lay several miles downstream. The horses' hooves splashed in shallow puddles that dotted the trail, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth. As they neared a bend in the trail that overlooked the raging river, T. Avon tensed. He raised a hand, signaling Clara to stop. She held the reins, eyes darting around. The thunderous rush of the water mingled with an unnatural stillness around them. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The bullet whizzed past T. Avon's shoulder, striking dirt. Clara gasped, spurring the mare in a desperate scramble behind a rock outcrop. 3 figures materialized from the scrub, rifles aimed. It was Ford Knowles and 2 of his cronies. "Well, looky here," Knowles called, voice echoing above the river's roar. "Told you we'd be seeing you again, Mrs. Finch. Couldn't let you leave without paying your dues." Clara's heart hammered. She slid off her horse, taking cover. T.S. Avon crouched beside a boulder, scanning the terrain. The road ahead was blocked by the armed men, the swirling torrent of the river on the right, and a steep ravine on the left. Escape looked impossible without a fight. Knowles fired another warning shot, the bullet ricocheting off a rock inches from T. Avon's head. "Hand over your horse. Your valuables? You can keep walking if you're lucky." Clara's stomach twisted with fear, but rage sparked too. Rage at being cornered, at losing everything Henry had left her. She cradled her rifle, trembling but determined. T. Avon locked eyes with Clara. In that shared glance, she saw a calm resolve. He looked at the swirling water behind them, then at the men blocking the path. Any direct confrontation would be deadly. Then he saw something else, an old trapper's path cutting down toward the riverbank, half concealed by brush. It was risky, leading straight to the floodwaters, but it might offer a path out of this ambush. "I'll draw their fire," he said, voice low. "Take the horse. Go down that path. I'll meet you by the crossing." Clara swallowed hard, her heart racing. "You'll meet me." He nodded, unwavering. "I will." Another bullet whistled past. T.S. Avon sprang up and sprinted to the right, zigzagging across open ground. Knowles' men shouted, shots cracking in the damp morning air. Clara seized the moment, urging the mare down the rough slope toward the roaring river. She held on tight, branches snapping at her face. Mud and slick rock threatened to unsate her. From behind, she heard the staccato of gunfire. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw T.S. Avon diving behind a fallen log, returning fire with a pistol he drew from his belt. Clara bit her lip, fear for his life warring with her own instincts to survive. But she kept going. T. Avon had given her a chance. She wouldn't squander it. She reached the river's edge. The water was swollen, roiling with swirling debris. A makeshift rope ferry could be seen downstream, a narrow barge that might carry them across if it was still intact. Even from a distance, Clara could see the ferry moored to a post, battered by the current. Somewhere above, T. Avon still fought. Time was precious. If she waited too long, they might both be doomed. But if she left, could she leave him to his fate? She hesitated, tears burning her eyes, torn by her own sense of self-preservation versus an unspoken bond that had formed in mere days. A rifle shot boomed, and the echo carried down the ravine. Clara's heart lurched. Then she saw him. T. Avon sprinting along the ridgeline, ducking behind a boulder as Knowles' men scrambled to reload. In a daring move, T. Avon slid down the slope, half controlled, half falling, until he landed at Clara's side, chest heaving. "You made it?" she gasped, relief colliding with panic. He merely nodded, eyes scanning the river. Null's men might not be far behind. "We use the ferry," he said. "Now." Clara urged the horse forward. T-Avon ran beside them, stepping onto the narrow barge lashed to the bank by a thick rope. The ferry groaned under their combined weight and the horses' trembling steps. The river's roar was nearly deafening now, the water swirling around half-submerged trees. T-Avon unlashed the ferry with practiced speed. Just then a shout echoed from the slopes above. Knowles and his men appeared, rifles aimed downward. Clara crouched, bracing for a shot. One man fired, the bullet slamming into the ferry's wooden siding. The horse whinnied in terror, nearly tipping the barge. T-Avon caught the rope overhead that was strung across the river, using it to pull them away from shore. "Keep low," he shouted over the flood's roar. Clara ducked, arms over her head as another shot rang out. She felt the ferry jerk, lurching precariously. Then T-Avon gave a mighty heave, and the current dragged them swiftly into the middle of the waterway, out of range of the rifles. Knowles' curses trailed after them, drowned by the crashing surge of muddy water. They were adrift in chaos, the ferry rocking and straining at the rope overhead. Wind whipped their faces, and thunder boomed as a fresh storm descended. Rain began to pelt them, turning the world into a haze of gray. Though the rope served as a guide, the ferocity of the current threatened to snap it at any moment. Halfway across, a massive uprooted tree careened toward them, caught in the raging current. T-Avon spotted it first, eyes going wide. "Look out!" he shouted, yanking Clara aside as the trunk crashed against the ferry's side. Wood splintered, the barge lurching so violently that Clara lost her balance. She tumbled onto the slick surface, nearly rolling over the edge. With a guttural cry, T-Avon grabbed her arm, holding her back from the swirling jaws of the river. Water drenched them both, the horse neighing in terror. The ferry was breaking apart. Planks buckled, and one side began to tilt dangerously. Clara clung to T-Avon, panic overwhelming her senses. She glimpsed the rope overhead, frayed from the impact. If it broke, they'd be thrown downstream like driftwood. "We have to jump," she cried, voice ragged with desperation. T-Avon's eyes darted to the far shore, still 20 yards away through a churning torrent. Jumping into that flood might mean certain death, but staying on the ferry also spelled doom. A chunk of the barge tore free, swirling away in the current. "No choice?" he growled. "On 3, hold your breath and hold on to me." Clara's eyes widened. She clutched the battered horse's reins, uncertain. The poor creature was panicked, eyes rolling. T-Avon saw the fear in her face, recognized it as a mirror of his own. In that heartbeat, he recalled the vow he'd made to himself: never again would he fail someone who relied on him for protection. That vow sparked him into action. 1, 2, 3! They launched off the disintegrating ferry, plunging into the roiling water. The shock of the cold nearly seized Clara's lungs. She flailed, instantly pulled under by the current. Strong arms grabbed her, pulling her back to the surface. T-Avon locked one arm around her waist, fighting to keep them both afloat. In the chaos, the horse brayed, half swimming, half dragged downstream. The current hammered them, swirling them under again. Clara gagged on muddy water, vision spinning, fear screaming in her mind. T-Avon kicked with all his might, hooking his free arm around a passing log jam, trying to slow their momentum. At last, with a final surge, they reached a shallow eddy near a half-submerged boulder. Clara felt the rocky bottom under her feet. She coughed and sputtered, lungs burning. T-Avon's grip on her did not falter. He guided her onto the muddy bank. They collapsed side by side, gasping for breath. Rain pounded them, lightning illuminating the sky in jagged forks. "Are you all right?" T-Avon managed between ragged breaths. Clara coughed out river water, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "Why, yes, thank you." T-Avon collapsed onto his back, thunder rumbling overhead. He tried to steady his breathing, every muscle trembling from exertion. The swirling fear and tension of the crossing still raged within him. But they were alive. They heard a terrified neigh, and Clara snapped her head up. Her mare had managed to scramble onto the bank a short distance downstream, sides heaving, eyes wild. Clara exhaled relief, staggering to her feet with what little strength she had. "Come on," she said, voice shaking. Slowly, carefully, they moved to the horse, verifying it wasn't badly injured. The animal was trembling and had lost most of the gear they'd packed. Supplies were gone, presumably drowned with the ferry. Yet the horse survived, and that alone felt like a small miracle. In the midst of thunder and torrents of rain, Clara and Tia Avon pressed onward, forging a path through thick mud. Now on the opposite bank they could circle around, hopefully find a route to the next town. The storm showed no mercy, but they had no option except to keep walking, leaning on each other for support. Hours later, or so it felt, the day dimming into a murky twilight, they found temporary shelter beneath an overhang of rock in a wooded ravine. Streams of water cascaded down from above, but at least they were out of the direct assault of the downpour. Exhaustion weighed on them like lead. Clara sank down on a rock ledge, hugging herself to keep warm. Tia Avon knelt beside her, rummaging for flint and tinder in his soaked pouch. "We need fire," he said through chattering teeth. "To keep warm?" Her trembling hands reached to help. As they tried to strike a spark, the memory of the near drowning haunted her. The closeness of death reminded Clara of Henry's final breath, how she had been powerless to save him. She swallowed the knot in her throat. "Tia Avon," she said softly, "if not for you." He met her gaze, his own eyes etched with fatigue and something more, an unspoken sorrow. "I could not let you die," he said, voice low. Finally a spark caught on a bit of dry grass Tia Avon had sheltered in his vest. The small flame took hold, and they fed it carefully with twigs, bits of bark. Soon a modest fire crackled, illuminating the rocky alcove with dancing light. Steam rose off their damp clothes. Clara extended her hands toward the warmth, glancing at Tia Avon. She noticed a gash on his forearm, likely scraped on the submerged debris. Blood mixed with mud, trickling down. "You're hurt," she said, concern flooding her voice. He hadn't seemed aware of it until her words brought it to his attention. "It's nothing," he said reflexively, but she could tell it pained him. She pulled a cloth from her coat pocket, one of the few items she had left, and dabbed at the wound. Her touch was gentle, and he flinched slightly at first, but then he allowed it. "Thank you," he murmured. Clara shook her head. "No, thank you. You saved my life more than once today. I'm in your debt." A flicker of emotion passed through Tia Avon's gaze, akin to shame. "I have broken promises before," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I could not break another. Not when I had the strength to keep it." She didn't fully understand, but she sensed the weight he carried. The hush of the storm outside lulled them into a fragile peace. In that moment, a kernel of trust took root, born of shared survival, mutual sacrifice, and the realization that each offered the other a lifeline. When the storm finally eased, they were able to leave the rocky shelter, forging their way slowly through mud and undergrowth until they reached a trail that led northwest. After another hour, the land flattened, revealing a hint of wagon tracks. Reaching the next town might still be possible before nightfall if they pushed on. Yet the day's ordeal had left them drained beyond measure. Each step was an effort, the horse plodding warily behind them. With dusk descending, they came upon a small, deserted stable near the remains of a burned-out homestead. A grim testament to the territory's dangers, it offered partial cover from the elements, and they decided to rest there for the night. Inside the charred beams, a few boards remained unburnt, enough for them to reconstruct a meager shelter. The mare settled in a corner, nibbling nervously on leftover straw. Clara and Tia Avon collapsed, sharing a single blanket she had managed to tie to the horse's saddle before the ferry crossing. That night, as wind sighed through the blackened rafters, neither slept deeply. Tia Avon listened to Clara's soft breathing, attuned to every shift in the darkness. His mind returned to the swirl of the raging river and the moment he had decided, without hesitation, to risk himself for her. It felt strangely like atonement, a step toward rebuilding his shattered sense of purpose. Clara's thoughts drifted between memories of Henry and the present moment. She was amazed at her own sense of calm, lying beside a Navajo warrior she had met mere days ago, someone who had proven braver and kinder than most folks she'd known in her life. A pang of sadness mingled with a tentative hope that perhaps she was not destined to face every trial alone. Dawn came with pale pink light streaking across the sky. The storm finally passed. The air smelled of wet ash and new beginnings. Clara and Tees Avon trudged onward, half leading, half riding the mare when the ground permitted. By midday, they caught sight of a small outpost, a handful of buildings clustered by a worn sign that read Hayfield Crossing. Relief soared in their chests. Smoke rose from a chimney, and a blacksmith's clang echoed, reassuring them that civilization was near. As they entered the outpost, muddy and exhausted, a few wary faces eyed them. But no guns were immediately drawn. The place was calm enough to allow them to step inside a makeshift livery stable. They found a wrinkled older man in a leather apron, who raised an eyebrow at their disabled appearance. "Rove day?" he asked. "You could say that?" Clara managed, voice thick with fatigue. "We lost everything but this horse crossing the river." The man sighed, nodding sympathetically. "Heard the crossing got pretty bad. You're lucky to be alive." Silence fell. T. Avon's gaze flicked around, scanning for threats out of habit. But there was a gentler spirit in this settlement, a place not yet tarnished by the cruelty of men like Knowles. With the last coins Clara had, she rented a small room above the stable and purchased fresh bandages for Tees Avon's arm. While the old stableman brushed down the mare, Tees Avon stood quietly near the door, uncertain of his next move. Clara turned, meeting his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." He nodded. "I'm glad you made it." She searched his face, seeing the tension of parting, of unfinished business. "What will you do now?" He exhaled, glancing at the horizon. "I must keep going north. There's something I need to find. A place to start anew." His voice held a distant sorrow. Clara's heart tightened. She didn't want to impose on him further, yet she couldn't deny her own wish that he might stay. The farm still needed tending, and she knew the threat from Knowles hadn't magically vanished. But Tees Avon's spirit was that of a drifter, bound to an unspoken quest. She laid a gentle hand on his uninjured arm. "When you find that place," she said, "I hope you find peace. You deserve it." Their gazes locked for a moment, 1,000 unspoken words bridging the silence. Slowly a faint smile touched Tees Avon's lips. "And you," he said quietly, "may your home be safe and your heart find comfort." They parted that afternoon with little fanfare. Tees Avon, after quietly securing a half-lame horse from a trapper in exchange for labor, rode off on the muddy trail leading north. Clara watched him until he became a small figure in the distance. Her chest felt heavy with a mixture of loss, gratitude, and a strange sense of hope. Perhaps they would meet again. Perhaps not. But in the crucible of that raging river, something profound had been forged, a respect, a shared promise that each life was worth saving. A day later, after rest and supplies, Clara returned to her farm with a borrowed wagon. The cabin still stood, the orchard still clung to life. She feared that Ford Knowles might return, but a week passed without any sign of him. Rumor had it he'd gone further east, chasing another opportunity. In the following weeks, Clara fixed the cabin roof, bartered for seeds from nearby settlers, and took comfort in simple tasks. Often, her thoughts turned to Tees Avon. Sometimes she stood by the riverbank, looking at the roiling waters, remembering how close to death she had been, and how a man once deemed a stranger had chosen to risk his life for hers. At night, she would drift to sleep with a small smile on her lips, thinking of the promise unspoken between them that, in saving her, T.C. Avon might have also saved himself. And perhaps one day, he would cross her threshold again, carrying stories of redemption, ready to begin the next chapter of his life in a land vast enough for them both. In the silent spaces between gunfire and thunder, between sorrow and hope, we learn that a single act of compassion can bind two hearts more powerfully than any chain of fear. Mercy, given freely, does not diminish the giver. It lifts the fallen and lights the way through the darkest storm. And sometimes, in saving another, we find a fragile thread back to saving ourselves. Thank you for listening to this tale of redemption and resolve on the wild frontier. If you felt the spirit of hope in this story, please give it a like, subscribe for more Western sagas, and share your own thoughts or favorite moments in the comments below. Your voice keeps these campfire stories alive,